Thanks, Bernie. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, great. It's nice to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces. Thank you to Intel and the sponsors of this event, the agnostics and atheists at Intel, for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here today and to speak to you about my life work, critical thinking. If you'd like more in-depth content, you can go to philosophynews.com and listen to podcasts, videos, lectures. That's philosophynews.com. Okay. Did I just fade out on the mic? No? All right. I'm deaf in one ear, so it's a little tricky sometimes. All right. Before I begin, I'd like to briefly talk about the importance of making judgments. In our universities, we're teaching an entire generation of students not to make moral and cross-cultural judgments. We're teaching students to withhold judgments about beliefs and epistemic systems that are different from our own. I do not agree with this. I think we should be teaching students how to make better, more discerning judgments. We teach our youth not to judge about really, really important subjects, things that affect all of our lives in profound ways, about things that matter. Just for a moment, let the implications of systematizing the chronic withholding of judgment percolate. Think about what this means and what it says about us when we cultivate and institutionalize the value of saying, I'm not going to judge, or who am I to judge, or that's just their way of doing things. Other implications, this is a way to willfully, morally blind ourselves to horrors like the genocide in Darfur, North Korean death camps, or the wholesale massacre of civilians in Homs, Syria. The withholding of judgment is detrimental to creating healthy, vibrant societies. I want to retain my ability to make judgments. Specifically, I want to further develop my ability to make accurate and reliable moral judgments. When talking about critical thinking, we're really talking about how some ideas must be wrong, must be less good, or less useful. If you're not evaluating ideas or ways of thinking or epistemic systems, then you're not critically thinking. One common confusion that arises is when people think that making a judgment about an idea is the same as making a judgment about a person. It is not the same as judging a person. People require dignity. Ideas do not require dignity. I am not a relativist. I do not think that all ideas and all belief systems are equal or have equal merit. This idea is a cognitive and moral toxin. Relativism undermines the emancipatory potential of reason and rationality. It erodes the foundation of civilized societies, and with it, any hope that we should become more just, more humane, or more kind. Epistemic systems, knowledge systems, are not like pizza toppings. They are not matters of taste. They are not preferences. There are better and worse ways of reasoning, better and worse ways of coming to conclusions. This matters. The processes that people use to come to conclusions have real consequences for real people. Real ways of reasoning can and have led us to conclusions that are very hurtful to other people. Miscegenation laws were one example of this, where people of one race were prohibited from marrying people of a different race. In my opinion, the vote in North Carolina recently is another example of this. Yet it is not a moral problem that certain people use way of knowing the world that is less reliable and less likely to help them arrive at conclusions, justified conclusions. It is an epistemological problem. That is, it's a problem of knowledge and how we come to knowledge. Certain ideas not only can be wrong, but actually are wrong. In science, for example, think about the move from a geocentric model of the universe, where the Earth is at the center of everything, to where Earth is one of many planets revolving around many suns. Ideas do not become less wrong if more people subscribe to them. If enough people share a common belief, then it becomes culture. It is no less wrong for one to make a moral judgment about the actions of an individual than it is for one to make a moral judgment about a cultural practice. It is my hope that this presentation today will provide you with some fundamental ways of making better, more discerning judgments across multiple domains of thought. And yes, these techniques can be applied in the moral domain. All right, let's do it. The purpose of this presentation is designed for a general audience. It's to provide critical thinking tools that will enable you to differentiate truth from falsity. In this lecture, with additional time for Q&A, I'll discuss 3 techniques that you can use to help you figure out what's true and what's false. Let me begin by broadly defining critical thinking. Critical thinking consists of a skill set and an attitude. A skill set and an attitude. Here are the generally agreed upon critical thinking core components: interpretation, analysis, inference, explanation, evaluation, and self-regulation. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover these today. I want to note them for when this presentation becomes available online, because many people may want to dig a little deeper into the subject. The 3 techniques I'll discuss will allow you to synthesize and even bypass these traditional categories. In addition, critical thinking also has an attitudinal component. So critical thinking is both a skill set and an attitude. The following are, in my opinion, the 2 most important attitudinal dispositions that are indispensable for improving one's critical thinking skills. Do you trust reason? Do you try and solve problems using reason? Is reason your go-to? Is it crucial to formulate your beliefs on the basis of reason and evidence? And are you willing to reconsider what you believe? If you're presented with disconfirming evidence, what do? Do you write the evidence off as anomalous, as offensive? The ideal critical thinker would be genuinely willing to reconsider what they believe and formulate their beliefs on the basis of evidence, even if losing a belief makes them uncomfortable. A few years ago, my son, I have a son who's 10 and a daughter who's 5, and my son went outside without a coat on, and it was cold. And I said, "Sam, put your jacket on, you're going to catch a cold." And my wife said to me, my wife's a professor of medicine at OHSU, she said, "That's not true." I said, "Yeah, it is." She said, "No, that's not true." I said, no, that is true." So fight might be not the exact word, but we got into a disagreement about this, and basically I was ready to marshal my evidence and look on the internet, and it actually turned out that she was correct. My first reaction, though, was, "That's not true," rather than, "That's interesting, how do you know that?" So I think that as much as I try to do this myself in my life every day, I constantly find myself still being defensive and still not being as open as I ought to be. All right, so a quick question before we proceed. Which do you think is more important, the skill set or the attitude? I just want a show of hands. Who thinks it's the skill set? About 10. Who thinks it's the attitude? Wow, that's Intel, right? Good. Yeah, there's no right answer to this, but I think that attitude is more important. Learning and applying a basic and even intermediate critical thinking skill set is pretty easy. I can more or less teach people how to have a reasonable proficiency in about 10 hours. But changing beliefs based upon the results of applying these skills is significantly more challenging. I also want to briefly mention that changing one's attitude is something that's never attempted in an academic context. And in a philosophy class in particular, we don't do that. My colleagues don't do that. I do, they don't. Primarily because it's impossible to accurately assess whether or not one has actually changed one's attitude. But also because most philosophers don't view philosophy classes as intervention where some sort of attitudinal change is the desired outcome. I'm in the slim minority. I believe that changing students' beliefs is one of my principal objectives in some of my classrooms. I've also published articles about this that have generated significant controversy, and if you're interested, we could discuss some of those in the Q&A. With regard to attitude, the challenge comes not with changing one's beliefs in inconsequential matters or things you don't care about, but belief change with regard to substantive, meaningful issues that have emotional valence. Personally, I struggle with my willingness to change my beliefs. I have an ex-student of mine. We had just dropped my wife off at OHSU. And I don't know if you've been to OHSU, but the hill is really quite something when you come down it. And so I was driving down, and I was tapping my brakes as I was going down the hill. And I should back up and say I'm the least mechanical person you will ever meet. I don't own a screwdriver. I don't even know how to use a screwdriver. I've never opened the hood of my car in my whole life. I'm zero mechanical, negative. My friend, however, is actually a person who has fancy tools and uses these tools. He said, "Pete, what are you doing?" I said, I'm tapping the brakes. "I know you're tapping the brakes. Why are you tapping the brakes?" I said, "Well, I'm tapping the brakes to save the brake pads." He said, that doesn't save the brake pads. I said, yes, it does. I said, of course it does. Like, what? Like, in what world was I living in, right? Not that I could have a legitimate question about whether or not this action produces the result, but my first instinct, again, was to say, no, it doesn't. Why? Because I've heard it my whole life. I've heard it when I was younger. People I liked told me that. People I respect. It just came to be, there's an expression that, 1,000 repetitions equals the truth. But yet my first reaction was say, no, that's not true. And I think that is part of the attitudinal component of critical thinking. That's a vital dimension. All right, so that's the background. That's going to come up in the talk. Now we're ready to discuss some techniques. Technique number 1, simple question. A simple question. How does somebody know that? How does someone know what they claim to know? It's an incredibly, deceptively effective technique. This should be among the first questions you ask yourself when you're evaluating a claim, that is, what someone says to you. There are more and less reliable ways of knowing and more and less reliable ways of coming to conclusions. Asking the question, how does someone know that, will allow you to examine the reasoning one has for one's beliefs. This question will help you distance yourself from thinking in terms of conclusions, and the slide shows some conclusions. Instead, the move that you should be making is to think only in terms of processes. What process did someone get to help them arrive? Did someone use to help them arrive at that conclusion? There are good and bad ways that people have for holding a belief. Here are some surprisingly common bad ways that people use when they claim to know things. Someone told them. Someone told me it was true. My mother, my aunt, a school teacher. I saw it on the internet. That speaks for itself, right? 20, 25 years ago, it used to be I saw it on TV. We've matured technologically. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. Just like I knew that everybody knows that if you go outside without a jacket, you catch a cold. This response signals that no one has evidence for what one believes, and the process to coming to the conclusion is likely unreliable. Claiming to know something because everybody knows it is not a reliable way to reach an accurate conclusion. The popularity of a claim is not evidence for the truth of a claim. My dog told me. All right, less common, but it illustrates something that's essential. How did someone arrive at this information? How did someone come to that conclusion? When evaluating conclusions, think in terms of processes or methods of reasoning, not specific conclusions or specific beliefs that people hold. Asking how does someone know that is a way to avoid attitudinal traps and biases we all have with regard to people's conclusions. Okay, so these are not reliable ways to come to knowledge, and beliefs formulated as a result of these processes are less likely to be true, less likely than if one used evidence. Knowing something through evidence and formulating one's beliefs on the basis of evidence is the best way to come to knowledge. This may seem incredibly obvious to most people, but when genuinely probing your beliefs, what percentage of beliefs do you hold that are actually based upon evidence? If you answer this question with an open heart, it will undoubtedly be fewer than you're ready to admit. Again, this is an example of the attitudinal component or the attitudinal dimension of critical thinking. For example, what about your political beliefs? Do you have enough evidence about a subject, say, healthcare, to have a justified opinion? Do you really have a solid grounding in the complexities and subtleties of the issue? Or do you have ideological leanings that color or dispose you to particular conclusions? And I think the example of healthcare is a good one because it really is so complicated and so complex. What about what happens to you after you die? How do you know what you claim to know? Did you formulate your beliefs on the basis of sufficient evidence? I don't know, as I've asked very few people. I see some folks I've met. I don't know. I haven't asked most people the answer to this question. But one thing that we're all subject to, myself included, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the idea that people who are not competent lack the metacognitive judgment to know that they're incompetent. There's a funny story illustrating this effect. Two men tried to rob a bank without masks. When they were caught, they were incredulous. claiming that lemon juice they rubbed on their face made them immune to security cameras. It was then that the researchers realized that not only were these men too stupid to rob a bank, they were too stupid to know that they were too stupid to rob a bank. They lacked the metacognitive ability to make a judgment about their own abilities. The Dunning-Kruger effect is hard to avoid, but being humble about what one claims to know goes a long way. My own personal rule is that if somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer, I say, I don't know. I do not pretend to know things that I do not know. I think that this is also an honest and an authentic way to live your life. So back to technique number 1. Always ask how someone knows what they claim to know. Do they know the claim through the result of a reliable process? If so, that just increases the likelihood that what they claim to know is true. It doesn't guarantee that the claim is true. Again, focus on the process one uses and not on the conclusion. Okay. Number 2, counterexamples. Can you think of an example or an instance of a thing that will make the claim false? This will become clear after we practice. I'll give you some claims, and you generate an instance or an example of a thing that will make the claim false. Just raise your hand if, I know it's a big audience, but let's see if we can do this. Just raise your hand, and we'll just call on you and just shout something out. These examples increase in difficulty. The numbers 3, 5, 7, and 9 are all prime, therefore all odd numbers are prime. 33. Bingo. It's an instance of a thing that proves the claim to be false. Everything natural is good for you. Arsenic. Yeah, arsenic, that's good. Yeah, that's good. I heard this, I was driving down the road a while ago and I heard a commercial in which 2 young women were talking, and one woman said something, well, you know, your face looks great. Yeah, I got rid of my acne. How did you do that? Well, you know, I used whatever it was, Zitbegon or what have you. And the other, you're going to market that, it's good. And the other young woman said, well, is it good for you? And she said, of course it's good. It's all natural. A lot of things that are all natural that I would not rub on my face. Plutonium, poison ivy, etc. So those call into question the initial claim. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Here's how to think about that question. Can you think of an example of when there's smoke but no fire?
My oven.
What would you say?
My oven.
Your oven. Oh yeah, when it smokes but no fire. All right, good, I'll take it. All right. Here's the next one. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Right? It's considerably more difficult when it enters into the moral domain.
Masochist.
Yeah, I was thinking that, but I couldn't say it. Justice is paying your debts. This is from Plato's Republic. In the Republic, he gives the example of paying your debts. What if you borrow a butcher knife from a man who becomes insane and later wants the knife back?
Paying taxes to support a war.
Anybody else? I'm not saying it's I'm just anybody else? Think about it. It is more difficult. All right. So counterexamples are examples or instances of a thing that call one's claim into question. To be proficient at this, like anything else, you need to practice regularly and make it a habit of thought. That is, habituate yourself to quickly thinking of counterexamples. A brief final note, you don't need to articulate your counterexamples. I've learned to never articulate my counterexamples to anything my wife says. Don't sleep on the couch. Keep those to yourself. All right, technique number 3. How could my belief be wrong? How could my belief be wrong? This is really, really important. These things are important, again, when people ask me about the Socratic method and using this pedagogy, this way to instruct. These things are all really important. They're most important when you place them on yourself. So how could my belief be wrong really is genuinely an important tool, an important question. what conditions would have to be in place so that my belief would be in error? Even asking yourself this question can create a cognitive space for you to buttress yourself from believing everything you think. Do not believe everything you think. This question, how could my beliefs be wrong, creates a space for the possibility of doubt. For example, if you believe that there's intelligent life on other planets, just ask yourself, how could this belief be wrong? How could my belief be wrong? Anybody?
Lack of data.
No, that wouldn't make it wrong. It would just, no.
For a fact, every other planet has no life.
All right. Carl Sagan noted something. We could be the first. Someone's got to be the first. Could be us. We don't know. We don't have enough data. We could also be the last. So being the first or the last forms of life in the universe are examples of how the belief that there are other intelligent life forms in the universe could be wrong. So the third and final technique again is, how could my belief be wrong? All right, let's briefly review what we've covered today so we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. I frame the purpose of critical thinking is that which enables you to discern truth from falsity. I noted that there is both a critical thinking skill set and an attitude. For the attitudinal component, we noted that critical thinking is a trustfulness of reason, among other things. It's a trustfulness of reason and it's a willingness to reconsider. We then went over 3 techniques that you can use right now, today, to improve your critical thinking. Technique number 1 is to ask how someone knows what they claim to know. If what they know is not based upon evidence, if it's based upon an unreliable process, then it's less likely to be true. I'll just want to say, parenthetically, but it's important, people misunderstand the word know, what it means to know. When you say you know something, you're making a claim about the world. That's an objective claim. It's not a subjective claim. Let's say, we talk about that in the Q&A if you want, but I have to keep it down to 22 minutes. Okay, within this context, we also discussed the Dunning-Kruger effect. That is, when one lacks metacognitive tools to make reliable judgments, particularly with regard to one's own competence. Then I discussed the second technique, counterexamples, generating examples or instances of things that make suspect certain claims or hypotheses. We ran through a brief series of examples, and I finally noted the third technique, how could this belief be wrong? How could my belief be wrong? What conditions would have to be in place for my belief to be incorrect? All right, the application of these 3 techniques comprise the lecture component of the critical thinking class. Thank you very much for attending this portion. Now we'll open up to Q&A.
Thank you, Peter. How about there seem to be there are things that I believe that are self-evident.
Okay.
At least I believe they're self-evident.
Right.
And I look it up and I try to understand what that means. To me, that means that's true without proof, which is, I guess, different than true without evidence. However, those things that are very important to me, that I believe, how do I look at those in a way that, I don't know. I'm tempted to say, it's self-evident, which means you got to throw it out.
No, that's a great question. Thank you for doing that. That's a great question. So I would say the first thing you need to do is to differentiate whether the claims that you make, the things that you believe, the things that you think are true, are subjective or objective. Are they statements about the world, or are they statements about your feelings and what you like? I am infallible in terms of the fact that I love my morning breakfast, bacon and spinach every morning like clockwork. I'm infallible in terms of my own tastes. I'm infallible in terms of what I like to watch on TV. Game of Thrones, by the way, in case you're wondering. So I'm infallible in terms of these things, but these are subjective claims. These are not objective claims. These are not claims about the world. So I'm infallible in terms of matters of taste. But that's different. I don't need any evidence for the fact that I don't like, I'm trying to think of a food I don't like. I don't know, horseradish on, ketchup or something. Like, I don't need any evidence for that. There's an immediacy to that. But anything else, you need evidence. And I'll just throw in one little piece. because I want to get to as many questions as I can. We assign probability values to the things that we believe. We assign confidence values, likelihoods. How likely is certain things? Certain things are more likely and less likely. How likely is it that this is a hand? How likely is it that the world existed before I was born? How likely is it that I actually know my own name? That what I think my name is, Peter Gregory Boghossian, is actually my name. I assign confidence values to that. Thanks.
Peter, you mentioned that you had children.
I do too.
Yeah. And I wonder if you could give us an example of the types of conversations that you have with them to try to encourage them to think critically.
Okay. So what I do, and we had spoken about this initially as a possible lecture topic, but what I do is I always ask, even if I think that my son has a conclusion that I myself happen to agree with, I always ask him, how do you know that? How do you know that? What's your evidence for that? What's your justification for that? Why do you think? And then I try to model, I think this is the number one most important thing, try to model the behavior that you want to emulate. So there's a great little piece in the beginning of Freakonomics about if you want your kids to be readers, the whole idea that you should read to them, forget about it. You should model the behavior that you want them to emulate. Have you see them reading. Like I bring my son to my classes, he's not at this talk, but I bring my son to, my daughter's a little too young. And so that they see that there's this genuine engagement, and I attempt to do the best that I can to model the behavior. So I don't pull because I'm your dad. And sometimes I change my mind when I genuinely change my mind to try to foster his capacity to think critically and reason effectively. I am worried when he gets older. No, I'm already starting to think about it. Yeah.
Would you please give me your definitions of those two?
So when I say what it means to know something, I think that's a huge question, but I think people often confuse or misuse the word to know, and I think there's some terminologic clarification that we have to work through. It comes from Plato and the Theaetetus when I talk about a very classical conception of knowledge. When I say I know something, three things are in place. I have justification, I believe it, and it's true. Justification, belief, and truth. In the way I use in this linguistic context, that's how I use the word to know. I have justification. Yeah, justification is I have a good reason for believing it. True, it happens to lawfully correspond to reality. That's things outside my head. And belief, I happen to believe it. So for example, if I say to you, I know that tomorrow the governor of New York is going to slip on a banana peel sometime in the day. And lo and behold, we read the papers, the governor of New York slips on a banana peel, and you say, that's unbelievable. How'd you know that? I say, well, my crystal ball told me. Then the question becomes, is that sufficient justification to warrant belief in the claim, your knowledge? Of course, you could replicate that, right? You just do it over. It's a testable hypothesis. You just test it over and over and see if it can be done again.
Clear. You can take these principles, you can apply them, and they can help you make better decisions. However, there's a social dynamic, which is that below a certain critical threshold of critical thinkers, you have this dynamic where absolute certainty is more persuasive. On the way in here, there was a discussion on NPR. A study was done showing that only 10% of the U.S. population strongly deny the reality of climate change. And yet, based on the media discussion of the issue, you think that the numbers are very different. That's an example of how absolute certainty, in the absence of critical thinking, is a more persuasive. It's something we use in advertising. It's the basis of the big lie in politics. How do we deal with the fact that without a critical threshold of members of the population engaging in critical thinking, it actually, in a way, loses persuasive power?
It's a great question. Just to back up 1 minute, I wonder if that question were reframed, or what percentage don't just strongly disagree, but disagree. I think that number would be significantly higher. It's an empirical question that I don't have data for, but it would be interesting to know. So here's what we need to do. We need a multi-pronged approach to the problem. We need to teach it in schools. We need to start in the K through 12 system, which is what I'm attempting to do, is to get critical thinking in the high schools in Portland. Events like these, of course, help, but even more important than that is that we have to institutionalize certain mechanisms so that like reify, to use a $2 word, we have to make sure that our institutions themselves are kind of embody these principles of critical rationality. If we can do that, I mean, it's a weird way to think about it because in a sense, it's kind of asking your institutions to do your thinking for you, which could get you into an even worse problem. But I personally have found that everyone, and I can see a few people here today that I know them, and my students personally, everyone's capable of living a life of reason. Every single person is capable of, there's hope for everybody, no matter how entrenched they are in a particular belief system, they can always embrace reason. But that's the attitudinal component. The skill set is easy. But many people are, it's called doxastic closure in philosophy. They're stuck in belief systems and they can't get out. They can't figure out how to get out. And they believe that their delusions are actually reality. It's a problem. And I don't think that that makes them an immoral person. I think it's an epistemological problem, as I said in the talk. I think it's a problem with the way they come to know. But even for even for those people, there's hope that they can embrace reason.
Do you have any observations or thoughts about how you reconcile decision-making about extremely complex topics where only a very limited set of people have the required knowledge versus the mass democracy like America?
Boy, that's a complicated problem. I think on an individual basis, good question, the first thing you need to do is to stop pretending to know things you don't know. That's it. So if someone asks you a question about healthcare, we need to create a culture where it's okay to say, you know what, this is a complicated issue, I really don't know. And that's not a badge of shame to say, I don't know when someone asks you a question that you don't know. So I think culturally that's the first thing that we need to do. Second thing is we need to be more humble about what it is that we claim to know. And again, that gets back to your question. We need to assign lower confidence values to things that we think we know, but we may not have adequate justification for those beliefs. And I think, again, to get back to your question, this is not a one-time, one-pronged solution. I mean, we have to teach this in schools. We need, the problem, look, part of the problem with this is, and even if you think about this talk in the larger context, you have to be willing to say that someone's wrong. You have to be. Or else you're not, there's nothing critical about it. You're just sitting around having a feel-good powwow where everybody's saying, yeah, it's a great idea. You go, girl, or go, boy. That's disingenuous. That's not going to get you to where you want to go. So oftentimes these things aren't a matter of skill sets, they're a matter of cultural values that we embody as a society. And I think that's where the real change needs to occur. Again, the skill set's easy. I could literally, if I had 15 minutes, I could teach you the skill. It's pretty easy. It's the attitude and teaching people, institutionalizing the value of either saying you don't know when you don't know, or believing on the basis. Look, this really is not controversial. It's not controversial and it's not difficult. Believe on the basis of evidence, stop pretending to know things you don't know. That's it. There's nothing more to it than that. And I come to Intel and I talk about that and I fill a whole room. It's not complicated and it's not controversial. But we need to make those things of value so that that value becomes embodied in society. And we are far from that right now. Just think about the process, so her boyfriend said to me this morning, just think about the process of how you make chips. You know how you make chips? I don't know the first thing about chips. But you use reason, you use a scientific method, you use certain processes. And then those processes that you use are more likely to get you chips than if you flip coins or sacrifice goats. It's really not controversial and it's not complicated. You formulate your beliefs in everything you do on the basis of reason and evidence. Don't pretend to know things you don't know. And just be more humble about what it is that you claim to know.
Earlier you were saying that we can use critical thinking to make moral judgments.
Mm-hmm.
Saying that given certain pre-agreed upon axioms, we can reason critically to a rational or moral conclusion? Or were you actually saying that the axioms themselves can be determined rationally? Are you saying we can collapse the fact-value dichotomy?
That's a great question. There is an incredible amount of controversy about that right now. That is one of, people say there's no what controversies are there in philosophy since, whatever. That is an incredibly controversial issue. I can bottom line it and give you my 3-word answer, I don't know. I don't know. It's been something I've been thinking about a lot, and actually it's been something I'm writing about. I don't know the answer to that question.
The idea is, if you have certain axioms about ethics, can you do you have to agree upon those arbitrarily? Do you have to choose those arbitrarily? Or can you actually prove an ethical statement rationally? I mean, if I say, you say murder is wrong and I say murder is right, can you prove me wrong from a philosophical standpoint?
So part of that is that there's some incommensurable, like you don't even need to use murder because that's complicated, because the word murder is it's a great question, but the word murder has contained within it is bad, whereas killing is a neutral word. So you could say things like, I have a colleague who is adamantly vegetarian, and I am not. And he said something like, if something is wrong with my reasoning, let me know. I can't say if something is wrong. It's called incommensurable. This person has this view, I don't see that as a moral problem. So the question is, how can we agree upon some, or can we agree upon some starting axioms? I think we can use, here, if anybody wants to follow up on this, John Rawls wrote a little thing called the theory of justice that talks about how we can derive ways of treating people in systems of justice. And then the very controversial Sam Harris, who's one of the leading, can't use that word here. So Sam Harris has come out with a book called The Moral Landscape, where he discusses that exact thing. And there are a lot of people bitterly disagree with him. All right, question.
You said the way your thought system is working is like you see justification, you see belief,
right,
and then you see whether it is true or false, and then if it is true, you accept it, right?
No, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but it's more complicated than that, but go ahead.
The question is, if you see justification, I agree, then you believe it. Why do you want to see whether it is true or false after you believe it? It doesn't make sense.
Well, if I understand your question correctly, and I'm not sure that I do, one thing that is incredibly difficult is this idea of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the idea, everyone does it, I do it myself, is that we start with the conclusions that we start with conclusions, and then we look to the world to justify their conclusions. I just rereading Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and this came up in that as well. So the problem is when people start with a belief first, and then they look to the world to justify the belief that they have. So they start with their belief, and if a piece of evidence comes along that doesn't comport with the belief with the conclusion they have, it's anomalous. It's anomalous, it's offensive, rather than taking a good look at the belief that they claim to hold. So think about process, think about ways that one comes to know, and make sure that the conclusions that come about as a result of that process both follow from the process, and that the process itself is one that is more likely to produce good conclusions. The problem is that it's very difficult. People dig themselves into these cognitive sinkholes, and they can't understand. They can't see other perspectives. But if I can just give you one thing, one deliverable to think about as you take home, genuine willingness to reconsider. Genuine willingness to reconsider will save you from tremendous intellectual rationalization. And very great. People use the word rationalize and reason. Rationalize doesn't mean to reason through a problem. It means to give bad reasons for it, to generate bad reasons for a belief. So think about justification, why you believe what you believe, and are you genuinely willing to reconsider? If you are genuinely willing to reconsider, that's the attitudinal component. You're 8/10 of the way there. 8/10 of the way there. Thanks.